Thanks very much, Dharmasaran. My challenge is to speak slowly so that Sangadarshini can translate me. I sometimes need to be translated into English, never mind German. And I have a tendency to mumble, so I'm going to try not to. So I want to talk about three images from the Parinirvana, from the traditional stories of the Parinirvana. And I want to talk about the nature of consciousness. Because as Dharmasara said very rightly, Parinirvana takes a lot of, well, you can't actually explain it, but there's no simple term for it. It means literally enlightened without remainder. Parinirvana. Nirvana means enlightenment. Pari means without remainder. Yeah? And the remainder just means the physical body. So there's enlightenment itself, and then there's nirvana, and then there's parinirvana. So you have enlightenment with a body and enlightenment without a body. Which would you prefer? We can do a straw poll. For the Buddha himself, parinirvana is a no event, is a non-event. Yeah? The great event in the Buddha's life, of course, is his enlightenment. For him, enlightenment with a body or without a body is neither here or there, really. It's a huge event for his disciples, and it's an enormous event for the history of Buddhism, obviously, is his parinirvana. In fact, you could think of the whole of Buddhism as coming to terms with the Buddha's absence, his actual absence. A lot of the traditions that we have in Buddhism are effectively ways of being in contact with the Buddha again. After this talk, there'll be a puja, a ritual, and we'll be hearing stories from the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, the sutra that explores the parinirvana of the Buddha. And really that's always a way of talking to the Buddha, of trying to get back into contact with the Buddha. So much of what we call Buddhism is really a desire to be in contact with the Buddha. And then more broadly, with the dead. Every time you're doing a ritual, I think you are also talking to the dead. And that's, human beings have always done that. It's only very recently that we've stopped talking to the dead. And the English poet W.H. Auden said that poetry was a way of talking to the dead. Yeah? And he said that a culture that doesn't talk to the dead is in trouble, because it means you don't listen to them, you don't learn the lessons from the dead. Anyway, that's a whole other point. So I want to talk about these three images, and I want to use that to try to explore the nature of consciousness. Partly, as Dharmasara said, from my conversations with people for the nature of mind, the project I did a while ago. So these are the three images that really strike me, when I think about the parinirvana. And I was trying to think about why they're so striking, and I've got my own little theory about that. Yeah. So the first image, a famous image that anyone who's heard the life of the Buddha will know, and again with these images, they stay with me, they stay with you. I find that I can remember hardly any abstract teaching. Like I was telling Fabian that to my shame, I can't even rattle off the Eightfold Path. I think I know it's vision and transformation, but that's only two things. I actually couldn't tell you what they all are. And I've been practicing Buddhism for a long time. I'm one of those people, I was one of those disciples at the back who remembers all the stories and the images, but none of the abstract teaching. I'm not that guy. But this image I remembered as soon as I heard it, and it's the image of the Buddha lying between two sal trees, on a stone bench. And as he's lying there, the two sal trees come into blossom, untimely blossom, and the petals from the sal trees fall upon him, fall upon the Buddha. I think it's an exquisitely beautiful image. But like any image that stayed with your mind, I think it's because it's actually very, very deep and meaningful. Yeah. My first reflection on it was that at the Enlightenment, if you remember that story, according to tradition, the Buddha, before he gains enlightenment, is surrounded by Mara's hosts, which are usually depicted as kind of demons and devils and throwing mountains. And in later descriptions, it's very, very graphic. And they throw all these weapons at the Buddha to be, in this case, coming up to the Enlightenment. And those weapons, as they come towards the Buddha's aura, turn into flowers and just fall around the Buddha's feet. In later, more elaborate stories of it, they also deck the tree of enlightenment and so on. Yeah. You see that this image of the twin sal trees, my hunch is that it's connected with that image. So the image of the enlightenment is that the demons throwing daggers and weapons at the Buddha is an image for the powers of hatred and animosity and so on, and violence and the evil, really. Bhante Sangharakshita, the founder of this movement, does believe in evil, by the way. He thinks it is a real sort of force in the world. And I tend to agree, actually. So they're the sort of javelins of evil, of hatred, of malignity. No, never mind that. I don't know what I'm talking about. And they're transformed into petals, yeah. But at the Parinirvana, there's nothing to transform, yeah. So all you've got is flower petals falling down, yeah. I think that's one of the reasons why it's so moving, is because it sort of refers back to that great transformation, but there's nothing to transform anymore. There's just these petals that fall on the Buddha's body. Interestingly, in the sutra, it's said that at this time, the Buddha suddenly became sort of glowing and bronze, as it were. And Ananda says, you suddenly become this incredible bronze, beautiful colour. And the Buddha says that's always what happens before the Parinirvana. So they're really images of sort of sacred decoration, as it were. Flower petals falling. And I always imagine these flower petals falling in silence. You have, according to tradition, you've got this huge assembly of people. Welcome, come in. That's fine. Don't worry. Don't be sorry. You're here. That's a very good thing. I can see you, Lucas. Looking sheepish. So those flower petals, they're sort of falling in silence as the Buddha is lying there. So you just have this incredibly subtle sound of the falling of flower petals. And yes, it's saying that there is nothing to transform. It's also, remember, it's an image of time stopping, isn't it? Or time being suspended. They're untimely blossoms. And this is an ancient sutra, so it's as old as you can get almost. And it's saying that at the time of the Buddha's Parinirvana, these blossom trees burst into untimely blossom and sprinkled flowers upon him. So I take that also, at least at the moment, I'm taking that also to mean that there's something that it's trying to say. And remember, ancient forms, they're no less intelligent than us, assuming we're intelligent, which is quite an assumption. Anyway, they're no less intelligent than us. It's just that their way of showing it is very different. So I think that what the image is saying, that whatever Parinirvana is, it transcends time. Yeah. Actually, the mythic image of flower petals falling on the Buddha is much better than saying it transcends time. Transcending time is a sort of abstract proposition and sounds like you need to be in university to think about. Flower petals falling on the Buddha is more how it would feel. Do you see what I mean? That's why images are so important. Images communicate how it feels to transcend time, which is much more important than an abstract argument for it, because abstract arguments are never ending and you can always refute them and so on. So I think that the image of the flower petals falling is trying to show you this is what Parinirvana is like. Something, time has been transcended now, so that blossoms come into bloom untimely and decorate the Buddha. Yeah. Time has become a decoration. It's become a species of beauty. Yeah. So time has been transcended. Whatever this story is trying to tell you, in its own language, it's trying to say time has been transcended. Because for Buddhism, time is a function of consciousness. It's not something that literally exists. Yeah, it's a function of consciousness. I said a bit more about that in the seminars I've been doing. Am I talking slowly enough? Oh, good. I have to watch myself getting excited. Because then I go faster and faster and tell bad jokes that nobody can understand. So the second image that really strikes me, and I find it both comic and wonderful. I'm struggling for English, never mind German. Is that according to the tradition, the story, the ancient sutra, the Buddha's lying between these twin sal trees, and one of his disciples is standing in front of him and fanning him, because he's obviously presumably has a fever and he's fanning the Buddha. And the Buddha says to this man, "Would you mind standing out of the way?" Excuse me, would you? I'm sure he does it very nicely, but he says, "Would you mind standing aside?" And there's like a ripple of concern amongst all the people present. You have to imagine this vast multitude who have gathered for the Parinirvana. And someone, presumably Ananda, I can't remember now, asks the Buddha, this disciple's a very faithful disciple. He was trying to help and make you feel more comfortable. Why have you asked him to stand aside? Yeah. And he says, well, it's because I'm entering my parinirvana, and all these devas, and devas means beings of light, but it's basically angels, really. It's the ancient Indian equivalent of angels, without Godhead and all that sort of thing, of course, but it's basically higher angelic realms, gods, goddesses, and devas. All these supernatural beings have come to, the Buddha would say, have come to watch my parinirvana, and they're getting frustrated because they can't see me, because you're in the way, It's just fully comical, isn't it? All these creatures come from all over the universe, and they're saying, guys, get the guy out the way, Very funny, isn't it? And the Buddha's saying, look, they're getting irritated because they can't see me. So, excuse me. You'd think supernatural beings would be able to get around that somehow, like move. Anyway, that's the story. Rather beautifully comic. And the Buddha says, at the moment in the sky above, he said, and it's very beautifully put, he says, there's not a space in the whole night sky around me now which is not filled by some deva or god or goddess. Yeah? He said that even if you took a hair from the mane of a horse, you couldn't prick it into the sky and find a place where there wasn't an angel, basically. Very, very beautiful, isn't it? That the night sky has become so packed with angels, to use that Western word, with its baggage of Christianity, I know, but let's not worry about that too much at the moment. But it's been so full of devas and gods and goddesses that you can't even find a pinprick really where there isn't one. I want to come back to the comic element of that, because I think actually even that's important. Everything's important in a sutra if you read it right. So at the end I'll try and come back to that comic element. But I think again, do you see how it's saying that space is transformed? Yeah? You've already had an image for time being suspended and overcome so that you end up with untimely blossoms. Yeah? And now you have a spatial image of space being transformed into gods. Yeah? When you think of the image, that's really what it's saying, is the whole of space is now as if it's full of gods and goddesses and devas and angels. Yeah? So, I mean, this only actually occurred to me yesterday, but it occurred to me that it's trying to say that whatever the Parinirvana is, it goes beyond time and it goes beyond space. At least it's saying it goes beyond time and space as we assume them to be. Yeah? And that would be a classic Buddhist understanding of enlightenment itself and consciousness. Yeah? So whatever the Parinirvana is, the story, and if you read story deeply, everything is in the story. I find this, it's also my type, because as I said the other day, a friend of mine, after I gave a talk, a little bit similar to the one I'm trying to do today. He told me that I'm not very good at abstract thinking and I should keep off. And it's true. I'm not very good at abstract thinking. As soon as I try and think abstractly, I think I sort of don't really believe myself. What's more, people don't believe me either. I just think I'm making it up, and I tend to think I'm making it up. But a story tells you everything. Story is about as deep as it gets, it seems to me. Again and again, I find what gets closest to how things really are is a story, not an abstract concept. Yeah? So just hold that in mind at the moment. So whatever the Parinirvana is, it's a triumph, as it were, over time and space. It transforms those basic categories of time and space. It goes beyond time and space. Yeah? So if you imagine my talk, you have to now imagine that I do a big sort of turn into another part of Kreuzberg and explore a whole other thing, but I will get back to the Parinirvana Sutta near the end. Yeah, because of course, another way of approaching all this, when we say what is a Parinirvana, really we're trying to say what happens when you die. Yeah? And especially for all of us here, what happens to me when you die. Yeah? Parinirvana Day is also our opportunity to reflect on death. Yeah? What happens when you die? My mother died just over a year ago, and she's very much in my mind. One of the mysteries of my mother's death, and my mother was not a mysterious woman, generally speaking. She died, it's very sad to see her die, obviously, but she died on the 27th anniversary of my father's death. And I had a strong sense that she was waiting for that day to die. Because that morning she seemed fine. She had her last cup of tea, and her last word was lovely, this cup of tea. I'd imagine that would be mine, because I'll always want a cup of tea as well. It's very English. And it was like, it was like she was almost waiting for that day. She wouldn't have known that it was that day, but it was the anniversary of my father's death. And I had this strong sense that my father was around and it was actually helping her in some ways. I don't really know how that fits with Buddhism. I'm not that bothered, but I don't quite know how it fits. But I had this very strong memory of going on holiday with my parents many years ago. I've got 3 older brothers and I've got a younger sister. So usually a holiday, I used to hate holidays, to be honest, but that's another story. But But this holiday, my brothers weren't there. They were all too old and they were going off with their girlfriends. My sister and I were still young enough to go on holiday with our parents. And for them, it was probably one of the first holidays that wasn't a massive job. Like if you've got 5 children and no money, and it's raining in Cornwall, which it always was, you know, what do you do with 5 children in Cornwall in the 1970s and it's raining? I mean, bury them? Just a thought. How they managed it, I don't know. So my guess is that, I wasn't going to talk about this, never mind. My guess is that, oh gosh, look at the time. My guess is that for them it was a much easier holiday, one of their first easier holidays where there were just 2 of us. And we did have a bit of money then, we did have a place we could stay, and my sister and I got on very well, so we didn't argue. And I remember them talking together, which is something they never did, because they didn't have time to talk to each other. You know, they were always, my father was, well, both of them were always working, or they were trying to raise us kids, you know. And my mother was very nervous of boats. I don't know why I've gone on this long story, but never mind. My mother was very nervous of boats, and my father, who has exactly the same hands as me, he would reach into the boat to pull her onto the jetty because she'd be very nervous of the skittishness of boats. Now that's a tricky word to translate. Skittishness.
I just understood you talked about goats, but it was boats.
Yeah, not goats. She was fairly nervous of goats as well, I think. Goats, stoats, moats. Yes, my mother was, rumours that my mother was nervous of goats. That's been wildly exaggerated. Anyway, I had this thing from my father, and I felt that's what happened when she died. She was they say she was very confused at the end, but actually that's a modern way of putting it. She could have been, like she saw her parents coming to get her. You know, I don't see why not. I don't find that delusional at all. I think that's quite likely what happens. I mean, one of my conversations in the Nature of Mind discussions was about near-death experiences, and it's very, very common in near-death experience, almost ubiquitous. What happened then? Okay, I'm knocking over photos, which isn't good. But what happened? A lot of people in near-death experience, they nearly always meet their parents. If they're children, interestingly, they also are reunited with their loved pets. You know, you meet a rabbit. But it's very, very common to meet your parents. And dismissing that as merely delusional seems to me to be our problem rather than hers. Anyway, I really felt that my father had sort of helped her out of the boat of her life into the next life. And she said, at one point, she said to me, I just want it over. And I just said, she was quite delirious at this point, and I just said, you need to talk to Dad. I don't know what to do now. You know, I can look after you, but Dad has done it, I haven't done it. I don't know what to do. But ask, he'll help you. And I sort of had a very strong sense that he did. Anyway, I don't know why I actually told you all that, but it's a bit of a discussion. But I think we must start to challenge our views about death. We're really very silly about it in a way that no other culture has ever been. Anyway, what I think where I was trying to go with all that is that the big question is what happens when we die. And the answer is, well, Bante's answer to this, Sangharakshita's answer to this, is you'll soon find out. Which I think you couldn't get a better answer. You'll soon find out. He said, people ask me what happens when you die. I say, you'll soon find out. And that is very much a Buddhist answer, which is never mind that's all speculation. The main thing it's going to happen, it's going to happen soon, so you need to get on with practicing the Dharma. That's a classic Buddhist answer. But the Buddha himself is very unwilling to speculate. In fact, he was renowned for not speculating. But the question of what happens when you die is still nevertheless important. The next answer after Bante's wonderful answer is that you don't know. Yeah? You don't know what happens, and I don't know what happens, and nobody knows what happens. Yeah? Philosophers don't know, scientists don't know, the rabbi doesn't know, the vicar doesn't know, the swami doesn't know. Nobody actually knows. Yeah? We think we do, but we don't. Yeah? So I want to then, in this sort of excursion, talk about three possibilities for what happens when you die. Yeah? Before I do that, it's worth remembering that we don't even have a very good word. So in this series of videos I called it the nature of mind. But mind is a problematic word, the nature of mind. Do you see how the construction of that makes the mind sound like a thing that you can know its nature? You see what I mean? Like the nature of knee. You can't. A knee is, at least on one level, a thing that you can know its nature. The mind isn't a thing. Yeah, it's not a thing, and therefore you can't know its nature. If it's not a thing, it can't have a contour. It can't actually even have number. If something isn't a thing, you can't have two non-things. You can't have a one mind, or you can't have a many minds. All of those, number only applies to things, doesn't it? So when people talk about one mind, that's actually alien to Buddhism, because it still makes it into a thing, just a very big thing, called one thing, just one thing. Yeah. Buddhism would say it's not two, which is a bit clever. But yeah, if the mind isn't a thing, number, shape, location, all those things that we attach to things can't apply to the mind. Yeah. So when we talk about the mind, we mustn't reify it into a thing. Subhuti, one of my own teachers, is very, very nervous of the language of mind for that reason. Buddhism talks about mental events, doesn't talk about mind. It talks about mental events. It doesn't give them a thing that they are created by called a mind. Yeah? But then you often use the word consciousness, don't we? What happens to consciousness when you die? We were in a conversation with Rupert Sheldrake, the English scientist, and he said, look, consciousness isn't a very good word because consciousness suggests that you're conscious, and most of what we call consciousness is not conscious. Yeah? So he said he preferred mind to consciousness, actually. He's a very interesting thinker, Rupert Sheldrake. He's been rather maligned for being anti-science. But actually Jan of Archer interviewed him. It's a wonder. Do have a look. Jan of Archer. Just type in Jan of Archer at Rupert Sheldrake, and I thought it was just a wonderful conversation. Because Rupert Sheldrake is a very curious. I hope he's not watching. He's an odd fish, as they say in English. He's an unusual man, but he's every inch a scientist. It's everything he says. Well, you should be able to test that. He's concerned with what, like he famously. This famous idea that your dogs know when your dog knows when the owner comes back. He just said, well, you should be able to test that. You should be able to find out is that true, or at least is that statistically more often than it should be. So he did all these tests where the owner wore different perfume, wore different shoes, drove a different car, came back at unusual times, and when you looked at all the evidence. Statistically, the dogs did know that their owner was coming back more than they should do. Yeah. Now that doesn't prove anything, but that is what scientists do. You say, well, that's what we say, that the dogs know when you're coming home. I remember we had 2 huge Alsatians, and they'd suddenly wake up from nothing and start barking and clawing the door, and then you'd hear that my mother's. She used to drive a coach. You could hear the coach coming, and anyway, they might just have great hearing, but. His theory is, okay, what does that say about mind? Is mind like a field that you can sort of come into contact with? Yeah. Anyway, so mind and consciousness are both very problematic words. Yeah. So we don't even have a word for what we're talking about, really. But you could say there are 3 possibilities, and I say you could say, this is from my discussions with the psychiatrist and neuroscientist, Ian McGilchrist, a Scottish thinker who's written this massive 2-volume book called The Matter with Things, which is a masterpiece, I think. Very readable. He says there's 3 basic possibilities. Yeah? So let's just rehearse those, and then we'll come back to the Parinirvana. So the first possibility is that the brain emits consciousness. Yeah? That the brain emits or creates consciousness. That's the first thing. And that is our common sense assumption. So we've got this brain, I won't go through the medics of it, but we've got this brain and it creates or emits consciousness. So when the brain dies, consciousness is destroyed. That's our basic assumption. We think that's a fact. So when I live, my brain is creating all this consciousness. When I die, that consciousness will be snuffed out with my brain. It's such a popular view that we take it to be a fact. It's actually an unsecured belief. Yeah? We believe that. We don't know it for a fact. We believe it with the same certitude as Victorian English used to believe in God. Yeah? We just take it as being a given that's unquestionable. Yeah? The brain creates consciousness or emits consciousness. Some of the theory is something like that the brain becomes so complicated, neurally complicated, that out of a certain level of complication and neurodiversity, all those medical things, with that level of complexity arises consciousness. Yeah? That's our basic common sense assumption, and you can see why, because the brain's evolved through millions of years of evolution and so on. It's not a bad view, particularly, it's just a view we've got. There are real problems with that view. Yeah? I can't rehearse all of them because I haven't got time and I don't know them all, but there are real problems with that view. Firstly, and perhaps most obviously, the assumption is that it's some kind of complexity, neurocomplexity, that creates consciousness in a way we don't really understand. But there's increasingly research into LSD, isn't there? And what LSD does is it closes down consciousness. It makes it less complicated, less diverse, and you have more experience. You have the absolute opposite of what you should have. Really, if you close down consciousness using that view, you should get less and less awareness. If you close down the brain, you get less and less awareness. More sort of, in a certain sense, controversially, there's more and more evidence about near-death experiences, NEDs as they're called. I interviewed someone about that, and she was like remarkable because she's this very, very ordinary woman who's sort of chatting very naturally about. She was a nurse, and that's how she came to want to explore it, because she kept on noticing these phenomena around death, which all nurses, I vaguely remember it, I used to be a nurse, and I remember, like, it all started for her because she was on a night duty. I remember doing my day duty, handing over from the night duty, and the night nurses said, "Oh, so-and-so's probably going to die by lunchtime. She spent all night talking to her mother, her dead mother. So she'll probably be dying today." And I remember that. So it was very, very common. So because of the experiences like that, she did the first English research into near-death experiences. We also interviewed somebody who has had the most dramatic near-death experience, where he went from having a 10% chance of recovery to a 2% chance of recovery. He was, and all doctors said he'll never be able to walk or talk or feed himself ever again, irrespective of the percentage. But he's now giving talks all over the world. He was pretty much dead, but he has written a book about these incredible experiences he had when he was dead, effectively. Yeah. Now that's still not proof. We're not in a world of proof here. We must be careful of that. And I don't know. I'm the last person to know. But all you need to know as a Buddhist is that our view that brain creates or emits consciousness is highly problematic. It's not at all straightforward. It's not a given, yeah? So that's the first possibility. The second possibility is that the brain transmits consciousness. Yeah? So instead of emitting consciousness, creating consciousness, it could be that the brain transmits consciousness. Very like a radio station transmits radio waves, yeah? Or a television station transmits the programs, yeah? So of course, if you damage the radio or the television, the radio waves, you can't hear the radios, but you don't actually believe that those stations have ceased to exist. It's just that the machinery, as it were, can no longer transmit them. Yeah? This is becoming a more standard view of consciousness, that the brain transmits consciousness like a radio transmits radio waves. Yeah? And if you break the radio, yes, you won't transmit the waves anymore, but that doesn't mean to say it's destroyed the program. Yeah? Something is still happening. Yeah? The third possibility is that the brain permits consciousness, yeah? Which is another possibility altogether. So you've got the possibility that the brain emits consciousness. You've got the possibility that it transmits consciousness, like a television or a radio, and therefore if it's damaged it can't do that. Or you've got the possibility that it permits consciousness. That the brain is like a limiter valve that allows more or less consciousness to flow through it. Yeah? A very striking thought. And you see how that thought makes consciousness extremely mysterious, because it's not being created by the brain anymore. The brain is permitting consciousness to run through it to a greater and lesser degree. Experientially, in meditation, it feels like that, doesn't it? You can get to states in meditation where your brain, and that's a bit problematic, but anyway, your brain permits more consciousness. You know, in the West, we've lost this sense of the depths of consciousness, that you can be conscious at different levels. I was once, weirdly, on a panel with A.C. Grayling, who's the English philosopher, who's very clever and a very nice chap. And I was asked to give the Buddhist view. Why was I there? I was so the wrong guy. I was asked to give the Buddhist view, and I was saying all things are impermanent. Eye roll emoji. And he piped up and said, that's just a truism. He just said that's just a truism. It doesn't mean anything. It's just a truism. A banality, a cliche, yeah. He said that's just a truism. And luckily I just said, no, but you're not taking into account that the state of your mind when you bring it to mind. So if I bring it to mind now, all things are impermanent, it has no effect on me at all, and it is a truism. But if I'm in the depth of meditation, in dhyana, for instance, in first dhyana, as the tradition would have it, if I reflect on things like that, it can completely change your life. Yeah? But he had I was really struck by that. Here we are, a Western philosopher, with no sense that the state of your mind when you bring a thought to mind completely changes. I thought that was remarkable. He should have known that, you know, it's amazing that it's been lost, you know. So you've got these three possibilities. The brain could be emitting consciousness, it could be transmitting consciousness, or like a limiter valve, it could be permitting consciousness. Now, Ian McGilchrist, who knows much more than I do, like this 2-volume book, The Matter with Things, which was the next book after his book called The Master and His Emissary, which is a huge tome of a book that took him 10 years to write. And remember, he's a scientist, so it's meticulously researched, which is something you can never say of me. I hate research. Anyway, I just think, let's just make something up. Anyway, it's meticulously researched, his book. He says, of the 3 possibilities for consciousness, this is our, big reveal. He says, of the 3 possibilities of the consciousness, he thinks the first, that the brain emits consciousness, is the most unlikely. Yeah? He says you don't know, nobody actually knows. It's important to remember that nobody actually knows what consciousness is, whatever we call it. You can see how neural pathways light up in the brain and so on, but nobody knows how you do this, how this happens. No one has a clue. Philosophers, scientists, nobody actually knows. It's called the big problem. You know? So he's not saying he knows, he's just saying, of those three possibilities, he thinks that the most unlikely is our common sense view that the brain emits consciousness. Yeah? And his argument is how can something so unlike matter be created by matter? Yeah? I had a bit of an experience of this recently because, as you can hear, my voice is rather croaky, and sometimes it gets very croaky indeed. And I sometimes have various other symptoms about my throat. So I went to see the doctor, and she immediately thought I might have throat cancer. So I was sent off to a hospital to have a scope to look at my throat. And nowadays you can sort of look at that yourself. It's all very interesting. Anyway, he showed me my vocal cords, and they're nothing to write home about. You know, they're just two flaps of skin. How on earth does that happen? We went to a concert last night, and we saw Act 2 of Tristan and Isolde, and they've just got the same kind of vocal cords. You know, how do you create that sound? You know, I think of all these great opera singers, Maria Callas, you know, Domingo, all these great that you could create. I remember the first time I heard a great opera singer. I heard Margaret Price in London when I was very young. And she sang this, it was in a Mozart in Così fan tutte, and there's a great solo for the soprano, and she looked a bit like my mother, a little dumpy lady, you know, almost holding a handbag, looking slightly shy. And you know, the music came, I knew the music, and then she just came into the middle of this room, little dumpy woman, and just sang this thing, which to me was like a miracle. Her voice filled this huge room, seemingly effortlessly, and utterly beautifully, these beautiful Mozart, I mean, it's a wonderful aria, great finesse and delicacy and virtuosity. And it's just these two little things. You know, how did that happen? How did you get to that? Yeah. McGilchrist says basically that if you think that matter can create consciousness, it's tantamount to believing in miracles. Yeah? How can something so like this experience we're having now, if you look at a vocal cord, or if you have to have a scope to look at the inside of your body, how can that possibly create this? If you chop the brain through, there's no space in it, there's no light in it. You know, how can matter create something so utterly unlike matter as consciousness? It's basically saying like it's like a miracle. His metaphor for it is like it would be like rhubarb. You know, what's rhubarb in German? Oh, that's it. If you can imagine rhubarb, it grows up with a big stem. You know, we used to have it as for pudding because it's very cheap. You grow up with this great big leaf. So you imagine the rhubarb growing up, big leaf, and then it grows into Mahler's fifth, or it grows into differential calculus. You just think, how is that going to work? You know, how can something like matter create something utterly unlike it? Yeah, like Mahler's fifth or differential calculus. Yeah. So he says that the idea that the brain emits consciousness is basically saying that you believe in miracles, that matter can create something utterly unlike it. Yeah, a very interesting line of thought. He's not saying he knows, he's just saying it's really problematic. You know? He thinks of the three arguments, the most likely is that the brain permits consciousness. Yeah? And this is from somebody who's a scientist, a psychiatrist, he's also a literary don. He's been in conversations with astrophysicists. He's like massively big-brained person. He came for supper once, it was very nice. He's actually quite shy as a person, and quite small, which is a bit of a surprise. do watch Jon Watch and my conversations with him. They're great. So anyway, isn't that interesting, this idea that, modern scientists have come up with this idea that the brain is like a limiter valve that permits consciousness. It's very like a sort of idea, a Buddhist idea, isn't it? I don't know whether it is, and remember, nobody knows, and I'm not saying I know, and I'm not saying this is what you should think. The very least is that you should know is your beliefs about consciousness are beliefs. They're not realities, they're not facts. They're beliefs, unsecured beliefs, like the belief in God or like the belief in fairies at the bottom of your garden. They're belief-based. They're not facts. You don't have any facts about it. You have a lack of evidence, basically. So you need to know that. You need to know that your common sense assumption that the brain emits consciousness, creates consciousness, is highly problematic, and that many contemporary thinkers and scientists, especially more relatively recently, think it's almost certainly not the case. Yeah? But we're doggedly carrying on with our nihilistic assumptions, as if that's just the nature of things, as if we're the clever, modern sophisticates who know how things really are, unlike these silly people in the past who thought you could talk to the dead. Yeah? We couldn't be more hubristic, really, we couldn't. We think we know, we're just parochial in time, just as anybody else. Yeah? We're parochials, really. So do you see how this might take us back to the Parinirvana Sutra in a slightly new way? That whatever we're talking about is beyond time. Whatever consciousness is, remember that problematic word, is beyond time. Whatever it is, it's beyond space. And that's very traditional Buddhism, that consciousness is beyond time and space. But the other thing that really strikes me, because as soon as remember that word beyond is metaphoric. It's not literally beyond. There isn't space and then there's something non-space behind it. And there isn't time and there's something called non-time beyond it. Beyond is a metaphor. Yeah? And the problem with that metaphor, it makes the Buddha actually sound inhuman, doesn't it? That he has a consciousness in which time and space no longer perdure in it. But you get that lovely comic moment where he asks his attendant to move aside because he wants all the Devas to be able to see him. And it's very exquisite, that, because he's not concerned with seeing them. Yeah? He's the Buddha, so he knows it's really important for all these Devas to see him. He hasn't got an ego, so he's not concerned with whether he sees them or not. He wants to make sure they can see him. He gives a last teaching to a new disciple, etc., etc. He acts as a Buddha does, yeah? And then, that very famous story near the end where Ananda is his friend and cousin and, goes off to weep, and the Buddha notices he's not there, and asks for an attendant to go and get him. Yeah? It was very, very beautiful. Here we are in the midst of a sort of cosmic picture, world picture of all these people surrounding the Buddha, a universe of gods and devas and angels watching the Parinirvana. And what happens that the Buddha thinks, where's Ananda gone? He was here a minute ago, where's he gone? And asks for him to be fetched. And then, you have to read through the sutras because they come to us in archaic languages. But basically what happens is Ananda is brought back, and the Buddha says, he sees he's weeping and he says, but I've told you all the time, everything is impermanent. I've told you all things have to end. I've always told you this. And then he rejoices in him in front of everybody. He just rejoices in Ananda, So do you see how remarkable that is if you think of it now? Because this is whatever consciousness is in itself. It goes beyond time and space, but that doesn't mean it leaves the human. At the center of this cosmic drama is, oh, my friend's gone off. What's happened? What's up? What? And then, he's very, very upset, you know. And the Buddha's sort of, from his point of view, there's nothing to be upset about. So he rejoices in him, you know. So at the midst of this picture of consciousness which is beyond all knowing, it's no less, in fact, it's more human, not less. Do you see what I mean? It always reminds me of that moment in the end of King Lear, which is my favourite Shakespeare play. And you know, every time I watch it, I think, I can't bear being put through it again. Just before he dies, he says, "This button here, can you undo it?" In the midst of this huge drama, you know, is Shakespeare's brilliance of sort of a button that's too tight. He says, I can't remember what the line is, but something like that, isn't it? "This button here, can you undo it?" In other words, in the midst of this huge tragic drama, there is the commonplace human. And the human is no longer that commonplace, actually. But so whatever consciousness is, it transcends time and space, but it doesn't leave the human behind. It perfects the human, is another way of putting it, you know. But perfection is a sort of Christian term. So I was going to say one more thing, but I don't think I will. I think that's enough. So what we have is these three images of the sal trees and timely blossom. That's an image of that whatever is being communicated here is beyond time. Yeah? Whatever the mystery of the Parinirvana is, it's beyond time. The devas filling the sky, that space itself has become angelic, so it's beyond space, beyond literal space. He rejoices in Ananda so that there's no loss of the human. The human is not denigrated. If we're not careful, we denigrate the human, I think, only too easily. There's a sort of modern cynicism that we hardly notice. You know, someone was saying to me that, you know, human beings are basically a lot of large mammals that have wildly overbred. But that's to denigrate the human. Yeah? We mustn't, you know, sometimes even climate activism, I think, if you're not careful, unwittingly ends up in denigrating the human. You know, we went to see Wagner last night, and I was left in this, you just wouldn't have believed that piece of music was possible. You can't denigrate that. Or you wouldn't believe, and there's so much of the great discoveries of science and so on. The lovely line by the American poet Wallace Stevens, he says, "How high that highest candle lights the dark." And he just, by candle, he means consciousness. Just how much of the universe is lit up by human consciousness. We mustn't get into unwittingly denigrating that. So in this experience, there's no denigration of the human. The human is given its full place in a world that's timeless and spaceless. Yeah. Anyway, so what I hope I've done is at least open up the question of what the Parinirvana is, open up the question of what consciousness might be, and to challenge our views of what we believe consciousness is, because that feels the right thing to do on Parinirvana Day.